April 1945. As the Third Reich crumbled, a solitary pilot took off in the world's most advanced aircraft. His mission was not to win the war, but to save a secret from oblivion. This man was Hans Werner Lurch, and what he knew about his enemy's airplanes could change the future of aviation forever. But to do that, he first had to survive the last flight. The cold wind from northern Germany blew steadily over the hangars of Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing center. There, amid electrical cables, unfinished fuselages, and the metallic echo of engines being disassembled, worked a man with a serene gaze and a restless soul, Hans Werner Lurch, born in 1912, son of a generation that believed the sky was humanity's new frontier. Lurch was not driven by ambition or glory. His battlefield was the air, and his war was against ignorance. While the world shattered in the name of ideologies, he waged a silent battle to understand what truly made an airplane free. In the winter of 1942, an unusual order arrived on his desk. A British Spitfire MKV had been captured nearly intact after a forced landing in France. The command demanded that he test it, reporting its virtues and flaws. When he first saw the aircraft, repainted with the Luftwaffe's black crosses over the RAF emblems, Lurch fell silent. Before him stood the enemy not as a target, but as an enigma. As he climbed into the cockpit, he felt the immediate difference. The controls were smooth, the panel seemed made for the pilot, not for the state. Later, he would note in his diary, "They designed for the man, we for the system." This would be the first of 125 different airplanes that he would pilot throughout the war, absolute record in the history of combat aviation. At Rechlin, he became the Luftwaffe's synthesis pilot. He tested, compared, dismantled, and reported every detail with scientific precision. He flew the Hurricane, the Typhoon, the Tempest, absorbing the roar of the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Napier Sabre engines as if hearing a new language. "They vibrate like wild animals, but obey human instinct," he wrote. It was impossible not to admire the enemy when one understood what they had built. With each new test, Lurch noticed something unsettling. Allied fighters were evolving faster than the Germans could keep up. Germany created masterpieces, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the Dornier Do 335, the refined FW 190 Dora, but while the Reich pursued genius, the Allies pursued efficiency. Lurch saw this as a silent tragedy. The obsession with perfection was killing the war itself. In 1943, he tested a captured P-47 Thunderbolt. Heavy, resilient, almost indestructible. The Pratt & Whitney engine roared like thunder, and Lurch perceived the contrast. While our airplanes demand technique, theirs demand trust. The following year, he encountered the P-51 Mustang, and admiration turned to reverence. "This is the pinnacle of American engineering," he wrote. Fast, elegant, without excess, dangerous words in a Reich that punished praise for the enemy. For him, flying the enemy was not treason, it was science. "The air has no flag," he would say. His colleagues called him an idealist, but he ignored them. Each flight was a meditation. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin fuselage, fascinated him for the balance between power and lightness. "It's an airplane that forgives human errors," he observed rare in German fighters designed for elites. Over time, he amassed comparative reports showing Allied advances in communications, range, and operational comfort, but many of these reports were ignored. The Nazi command did not want to hear that the enemy was better. Lurch knew that speaking too much could be interpreted as disloyalty. Still, he continued testing. A B-17 Flying Fortress and a B-24 Liberator, captured after forced landings, fell into his hands. He flew them through German skies to understand why they withstood so much damage. "They are not airplanes," he wrote. "They are metaphors for collective effort." By the end of 1944, Rechlin had become a laboratory amid ruins. Exhausted engineers slept in workshops, engines failed, and faith in the future vanished. Lurch, surrounded by smoke and reports, maintained his ritual, donning gloves, adjusting his helmet, listening to the engine come alive. He no longer flew for victory, he flew for truth. Few knew how much he risked. Testing enemy aircraft was more dangerous than fighting them. No manuals, no standards. A single failure and the engine could explode. Even so, Lurch climbed aboard. Each vibration was data, each turn a lesson. He believed that understanding the enemy was the purest way to win, not through destruction, but through learning. Unbeknownst to him, he was becoming the invisible link between two philosophies of flight that would one day shape the world. Lurch's admiration for enemy engineering became reverence. But in a Germany that forgave no praise for the adversary, that truth could cost him his life. And the greatest test was yet to come. As 1945 approached, Rechlin became a portrait of the Reich's collapse. What was once a temple of engineering was now a shelter for survivors. But amid the wreckage, Hans-Werner Lurch still gazed at the horizon with the same silent obstinacy. For him, the sky remained the same immense, neutral, and incorruptible. And perhaps for that reason, he refused to give up. The year was 1945. Germany staggered in ruins. The roar of Allied bombers was the new sound of daily life, and flames in the cities burned like torches of the end. In Rechlin, once the technical heart of the Luftwaffe, the mix of genius and desperation became ever more evident. Revolutionary prototypes still took off, even with destiny already sealed. Among them, moving with the calm of a surgeon and the soul of a poet, was Hans-Werner Lurch, the test pilot who had flown the impossible and now watched his world crumble. For many, the war was over. For him, one last flight remained. That April, the Soviet encirclement drew near. Roads were filled with refugees, hangars burned, and radios broadcast contradictory orders. Amid the chaos, Lurch received a mission that seemed absurd: transfer a prototype Dornier Do 335, Germany's most advanced aircraft, to Oberpfaffenhofen in the south, far from enemy troops. The plane, with its two engines arranged in tandem, one in front and one behind, seemed like a technological aberration, but it was, in fact, a jewel of engineering. Speed, stability, and power in a single body. If anything deserved to be saved from the collapse, it was that airplane. On the morning of April 23, 1945, the wind over Rechlin carried the smell of fuel and destruction. Lurch walked to the Do 335, observing the metallic gleam of the fuselage. The mechanics, silent, helped him prepare. None of them knew if that flight was a military mission, an escape, or a final gesture of respect to aviation. He simply said, "This airplane needs to survive. Even if we don't," the front engine roared first, then the rear one, creating an unmistakable, almost demonic sound. The control tower, already without real authority, simply watched the solitary pilot take to the sky. The flight was tense. Above him, the airspace was dominated by the Allies. Below, columns of smoke marked the Soviet advance. Lurch kept the Do 335 low, flying close to the ground, avoiding radars and interceptions. The panel responded with precision, and he mentally noted each vibration, each reaction. Despite the danger, he felt a strange serenity, the sense that he was participating in something greater than the war itself. "The sky remains the same," he murmured. "Only we have changed." When he landed at Oberpfaffenhofen, the airplane was intact, and with it, perhaps, the last gasp of German genius. In the following days, absolute chaos. The Reich crumbled on all fronts, and Lurch, surrounded by silent airplanes, knew his role had ended. He did not flee, did not fight. He simply waited. When Allied forces finally arrived, he surrendered without resistance. The Americans did not treat him as an ordinary prisoner. They quickly discovered who he was, the pilot who had tested virtually every enemy fighter and the only one to have understood, in flight, the mind of the adversary. During interrogations, Lurch responded with cool technicality and intellectual curiosity. He spoke of Allied airplanes with almost reverent respect, describing the Mustang as the translation of efficiency into wings and the Thunderbolt as the fortress that protects human error. An intrigued American officer asked if he regretted having flown for the Reich. Lurch replied simply, "I never flew for Hitler. I flew for the sky." That phrase would define him forever. After the war, he was not immediately taken to the United States. Unlike the scientists of Operation Paperclip, Lurch was not incorporated into secret programs. He spent a brief period under British custody, collaborating on technical reports about captured aircraft. His notes, meticulous, poetic, sometimes philosophical, circulated among Allied engineers, becoming a silent reference in the rebirth of Western aviation. When he finally returned to a divided and devastated Germany, he found no more Luftwaffe, no Rechlin. But he found something more enduring, the certainty that knowledge survives war. Over time, he would help in the reconstruction of civil aviation, applying the same precision he once dedicated to fighters. In the following years, his testing methods would be studied, copied, and adopted by NATO, even if his name was rarely mentioned. The Dornier Do 335, the very one he had piloted on the final flight, would be captured by the Americans and taken to Wright Field in Ohio. Years later, restored and displayed at the National Air and Space Museum, it would become a living relic of the end of an era. No symbol could better represent Hans Werner Lurch's legacy, an airplane that survived fanaticism and oblivion because someone believed the sky deserved to be understood, not used. The airplane was safe, but now the pilot who knew all the secrets of the sky was about to fall into the hands of the enemies he so admired. In the Germany emerging from the ashes, Lurch would return to writing. His words would become a reminder that even in the ruins of war, curiosity is a form of resistance. And so, the man who once piloted the future ahead of time passed into history not as a hero or traitor, but as the interpreter of the air, the one who understood that true victory is understanding why we fly. May 1945. Germany finally surrendered in ruins. But amid the destroyed cities, the sound of engines still echoed not as a threat, but as a memory. At Wright Field, Ohio, the heart of the new American air empire, engineers and pilots studied everything the war had left behind: engines, wings, instruments, and enemy secrets. There, amid clipboards and fuselages, reports began to circulate, written with unusual precision. They came from Germany, signed by a name few knew, Hans Werner Lurch. He was not among the scientists officially taken by Operation Paperclip, but his observations found their way through Allied officers who had interrogated him. Lurch described the flight behavior of each fighter he had tested: Spitfire, P-47, P-51, P-38, Hurricane, Tempest, Typhoon, and his analyzers were so rich in detail that they seemed written from inside the soul of the machines. The Spitfire sings. The Mustang converses. The Me-109 demands submission. The Me-262 whispers the future. He wrote, "This was not propaganda. It was science in its purest form." American engineers noticed something curious. Lurch's descriptions matched their own empirical tests. When he said the P-47 survives the pilot, they were faced with an observation that went beyond performance. It was a design philosophy. He understood what the airplanes wanted to say, and that made him valuable, even from afar. It was through these reports that Lurch's name began to circulate discreetly in technical meetings, cited as the German who understood the enemy better than anyone else. Meanwhile, in defeated Germany, Lurch tried to rebuild a life. There were no more hangars, no airplanes, no homeland that recognized his work. The Luftwaffe had vanished, and civil aviation was under temporary prohibition. Still, he wrote, technical reports on stability, safety, and aerodynamic behavior began to reappear under his name in small specialized publications. He no longer spoke of power or war. He spoke of precision, ergonomics, and technical humility. A good airplane, he said, is one that protects even its pilot's errors. Over time, his reputation led him to work as an informal consultant for small aviation companies emerging in northern Germany. His knowledge, once used to win battles, now served to teach safety and efficiency. Many young engineers saw him as a legendary figure, the man who had flown over 100 aircraft and survived the fall of an empire. Lurch never boasted. He simply said that the sky is neutral. It's we who decide what to do in it. In the second half of the 1940s, British technical reports began to cite him by name. A Farnborough document described his observations on the Me-262's behavior and compared them with our AF field measurements, confirming their accuracy. Other engineers at aviation congresses began reproducing his ideas on the importance of simplicity over genius, a concept that would deeply influence post-war Western design. Unbeknownst to him, Lurch was becoming an invisible mentor of modern engineering. By the end of the 1940s, when commercial flights returned to Germany, he was invited to contribute to standardization studies for civil aviation. His vision was clear: aviation must serve life, not politics. That simple, powerful phrase echoed like a confession and a lesson. The man who once flew prototypes under the Reich symbol now helped design a more human aviation, focused on the passenger, the engineer, and the common pilot. In 1950, he settled in Hamburg, where he lived discreetly. There, he began drafting a manuscript that would become, decades later, one of the most respected books in aeronautical literature, Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. It was not a glorious autobiography, but a compendium of science and introspection. In its pages, he described with almost poetic honesty the moments when he felt the air speak through the wings. His comparisons between enemy and German airplanes revealed a borderless technical gaze and a humility that made him unique among pilots of his generation. Throughout the 1950s, the Cold War reignited interest in anything that could offer technological advantage. New airplanes, new projects, new fears. Lurch followed from afar, observing the world repeat the same mistake at greater speeds. When asked about the future, he replied calmly, "Technology has no morals. Purpose is what defines whether it saves or destroys." It was his way of warning a new generation of engineers that progress without conscience only reinvents the same danger with different wings. Thus, little by little, the man who had flown to understand the enemy transformed into a philosopher of the air. His voice, once confined to hangars, began to inspire an ethical vision of engineering, a legacy that would endure far beyond the engines he once heard roar. 1950 seconds decade. Germany began to rebuild not only its cities, but its own identity. Among re-erected factories and new engineers trying to understand the past without repeating it, a name circulated discreetly: Hans-Werner Lurch. He lived in Hamburg, far from politics and military glories, dedicating himself to civil aviation and technical research. The same skies that once saw him test war prototypes now saw him write about safety, stability, and the importance of designing machines that served life, not ideology. "Aviation is only justified," he said, "when it takes more people into the air than it lets fall from it." He was a man who had touched the limit of engineering and the abyss of destruction, and for that reason, he spoke with a serenity few understood. The young engineers who visited him in Hamburg found a silent master, surrounded by notebooks of notes, diagrams, and old measuring instruments. He reviewed reports, corrected calculations, discussed aerodynamics as if he were still at Rechlin, but with a new purpose. "Before, we flew to prove power," he said. "Now we fly to prove we've learned." In 1954, Lurch began gathering his memories, not as an autobiography, but as documentation of an era. The result would be published decades later under the title Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. The book described, with almost literary meticulousness, flights in captured Allied aircraft. Each chapter was a technical and emotional dive: the Spitfire, the P-51, the Tempest, the Hurricane, the Thunderbolt, the Lightning, and even the bombers B-17 and B-24. Lurch narrated the machine's behavior as if describing human personalities. "The Spitfire sings," he wrote. "The Mustang converses. The Messerschmitt shouts. The Me-262 whispers the future." These descriptions, beyond poetic, were technically impeccable. He did not write to impress, but to teach. And unknowingly, he created a work that would unite two worlds, that of science and that of contemplation. For Lurch, flying had never been merely a technical act, it was a spiritual experience. "In the air, man is closer to truth," he said, "because there any life falls." During the 1960s, the German aeronautical industry was reborn under strong European influence. Lurch became a technical consultant in various programs, helping establish testing and safety standards. Even as age advanced, he still climbed into small civil airplanes to feel, in practice, what the numbers did not reveal. Younger engineers watched him with silent reverence. They said that when Lurch touched the controls, the airplane seemed more docile, as if it recognized the touch of someone who understood its soul. But within him lingered a persistent unease. The world was dividing again now between USA and USSR, and the same technologies that once promised to liberate humanity were being used anew as instruments of power. Lurch recorded in his diary a phrase that summed up his disillusionment: "Man repeats his mistakes with faster airplanes. Only the noise changes." Even so, he maintained faith in aviation as a symbol of what humanity could still do best. In 1964, he accepted an invitation to lecture in England before RAF engineers and former wartime enemies. As he entered the auditorium, silence was absolute. And when he praised the Spitfire, saying it flew as if sculpted for the wind, the audience rose and applauded. It was a historic moment. The man who once tested the enemy's airplane was now celebrated by his former adversaries as a spirit free of war. In the following years, he came to be seen as a kind of aviation sage, not for the number of flights, but for the depth of what he said about them. In a 1971 interview, when asked about the space race and supersonic jets, he replied with disarming calm, "The sky remains the same. It's we who are farther from it." That phrase would travel the world, reproduced in technical magazines and on murals in aviation academies. In old age, Lurch wrote less, but observed more. He spent hours by runways noting noises, angles, vibrations. Sometimes he received visits from students seeking advice on engineering or the philosophy of flight. He always answered the same: "You'll only understand what aviation is when you love what the enemy builds as much as what you build yourselves." It was the essence of his wisdom and perhaps his purest form of forgiveness. In 1977, his book was finally published officially. It became required reading in flight academies and aeronautical engineering departments. It was not merely a technical record, it was the spiritual testament of a man who crossed the war without letting it corrupt his curiosity. Lurch showed, page after page, that science and empathy can coexist and that understanding the enemy is, ultimately, understanding oneself. Late 1970s, Germany was no longer divided by bombs, but by a wall. The world had changed, but the wind over Hamburg remained the same, cold, clean, carrying the distant sound of civil airplanes crossing the sky. In his simple home, surrounded by diagrams and notebooks, Hans Werner Lurch watched the sunset reflect on the windows and thought that, perhaps, everything he had done in life had been to understand that instant of silence between the engine and the air. His book, Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II, had been officially published in 1977 and quickly gained the respect of the global aeronautical community. In universities, engineers cited him. At congresses, his name resurfaced as that of someone who had touched the heart of aviation. For the first time, the man who piloted the enemy's airplanes was recognized not as a traitor, but as an interpreter of an era. With the book's success came unexpected invitations. France, England, the United States all wanted to hear the German who had piloted the impossible. In a lecture in Toulouse, a young engineer asked what he had learned after flying so many machines. Lurch paused at length and replied, "They all have a soul. The Spitfire is art. The Mustang is logic. The Me-262 is ambition. But none of them is freedom. That we still haven't learned to build." The auditorium fell silent. It was the confession of a man who had seen genius and fanaticism intertwine until they destroyed a continent. In the 1980s, the technological world surpassed everything he had once imagined. The Concorde crossed the Atlantic in 3 hours, jet airplanes traversed the sky effortlessly, and space probes carried the human gaze beyond Earth. Lurch observed it all with humility and fascination. "Every modern innovation," he wrote, "is the daughter of past failures. Progress is always the repair of an error." He said the Americans would not have gone so far without the curiosity Germany forced upon them, and that the Germans only understood efficiency by observing the Americans. This symmetry, this mirror between enemies, was the foundation of his philosophy. Progress is the child of humility. Even far from hangars, he kept the habit of writing personal reports. In 1982, he recorded a phrase that would become a kind of intellectual epitaph: "Genius is neutral. Purpose decides whether it saves or destroys." For him, science was a flame, and each generation needed to decide whether to use its light or its fire. That was why, when he looked at the skies and saw commercial airplanes crossing borders that were once battlefields in tranquility, he felt peace. Those machines, he thought, were the true victory not of a country, but of human reason. In 1984, he received a letter from the United States. Inside, a black and white photograph showed 2 men in front of a P-51 Mustang. On the back, the dedication read, "To the man who taught us to listen to the sky." Lurch kept the photo on his desk. Sometimes, before writing, he looked at it as if conversing with an old friend. It was proof that, even among enemies, respect survives when curiosity is stronger than hate. In his final years, he lived in tranquility. He received young reporters who came to interview the pilot who flew all sides of the war. He spoke in a low but firm voice. "I only wanted to understand why we fly," he said. "The rest was consequence." It was his way of summing up an entire life dedicated to truth. When he died in 1993, at 81 years old, the local news recorded his death in a few lines. But in the aviation world, his passing was felt as the end of an era. Pilots and engineers from various countries sent messages of condolence. One wrote, "He didn't win battles, but he conquered oblivion." Years later, when the archives of Rechlin and Oberpfaffenpfeifen were opened, Lurch's original reports were found there. They were impeccable notes, with drawings, calculations, and phrases that blended scientific precision and human sensitivity. "The air has no flag," one said. "It only waits for man to deserve it." Historians were stunned. They were not before a mere test pilot, but a philosopher of engineering. Today, his name rests on small plaques scattered across museums in Germany, England, and the United States. Some call him Luftwaffe test pilot, others post-war technical collaborator, but no description is sufficient. Hans Werner Lurch was more than a pilot. He was the man who transformed the act of flying into an act of understanding. He proved that when humanity chooses to observe the enemy with admiration instead of hate, the sky becomes a mirror and mankind, for an instant, learns to rise above itself. And perhaps that is why, even today, when young engineers open his diaries and find the phrase, "There is no flag," they understand the true legacy he left. Aviation is not about victory or conquest, it is about redemption. About looking at the horizon and realizing that the sky remains the same, waiting only for man to finally learn to deserve it.